Okay, so my presentation is going to be about the controversy around the death of John Wilmot, the second Earl of Rochester, specifically Rochester's descent into Christianity. This presentation is going to explore Rochester's attitude towards death and God and his work, but it's also going to discuss other people's perceptions of Rochester's so-called repentance. We'll be looking at two works by Rochester, and we'll also be looking at some passages on the life and death of John, Earl of Rochester, by a man called Gilbert Burnet. When Rochester died, July 26, 1680, he died a converted Christian. He'd taken the sacrament and he'd convinced his wife Elizabeth to do the same, converting from Catholicism. He also dictated a remonstrance in which he asks people not to follow in his footsteps. And he also asks them to repent for their sins against God. He signs this and he has it read out to the whole household, so even the pig boy knows not to follow in his footsteps. This is a very different attitude to the Rochester of the past, and very different to the stance he takes in this poem, the Disabled Debauchee, or the Maimed Debauchee. So this is possibly composed 1675, 5 years before his death. But Rochester does know that he is dying. When we look at this poem, it's interesting to think whether or not this is a sobering experience for Rochester, writing about his own death, or is this another aspect of his life that he can satirize? So we can never say for certain whether or not Rochester's actually writing about himself in any of his poems, even when he says I, or addresses the narrative I. But we can sort of go with the idea that perhaps this is autobiographical. From some of the lines, he says, so when my days of impotence approach, and I by pox and wine's unlucky chance forced from this pleasing billows of debauch on the dull shores of lazy temperance. We know that Rochester has the pox, we know that he has syphilis. Wine's unlucky chance, we know he's been drunk solidly for about 5 years. We know that he is becoming impotent because of the not only the venereal disease, but the ulcers in his bladder. So we can sort of go with this idea that maybe this is autobiographical. The stance he takes in The Disabled Debauchee is one of a man who is not at all regretful of his life choices. When he says, from whence with thoughts full of concern, he views the wise and daring conduct of the fight, while each bold action to his mind reviews his present glory and his past delights. He's talking about his life as if it was something glorious, something wonderful has happened. It's called The Disabled Debauchee, but it's set in heroic stanza. So he's already putting himself in as a war hero, as someone who survived something, and although he's dying, what he did was glorious. He's likening himself to soldiers who fought for king and country. If we move on a little bit further, it says, nor let the sight of honourable scars, which my tooth-forward valour procure, frighten new listed soldiers from the wars. Past joys have more than paid what I endure. And this isn't the words of a man who doesn't want people to follow in his footsteps. This is the words of a man who is more than happy for people to follow the life he took, follow the libertinism and the rakishness. He doesn't want his life to frighten people off of the enjoyments that he's received. This sort of last part here, he's saying that it doesn't matter that he's dying, because he had a good time while he was doing it. Of course, in this poem, Rochester's got a relatively carefree attitude towards his illness. But we know that this attitude starts to shift around 1678, 1679, when he falls very, very ill. He's very sick, and he begins this conversation with a clergyman and friend, Gilbert Burnet. He summons him to his bedside, not for any want of personal reasons to talk to a clergyman, but because it's a part he has to play. He knows that his friends and family want this to happen. So he invites Gilbert Burnet, someone who has talked to some of his friends before in deathly situations. So in this time, Gilbert Burnet and Rochester talk about whether or not Rochester needs to repent his past, whether he needs to start believing in God. And Burnet's trying to convince him of this. But Burnet writes, he had great remorse for his past life, but he afterwards told me they were rather general and dark horrors than any conviction of sinning against God. This is sort of reflected a little bit in The Disabled Debauchee, where he is talking about how his body is wasted, he is going to die. He knows he knows at this point that he is going to die at some point. and he is ashamed that he's wasted his body so early on in his life. But he's not talking about any God, he's just talking about sort of himself and control of himself. After many hours and many days of conversations, Bennett writes, after many discourses upon this subject, he still continued to think all was the effect of fancy. He said that he understood nothing of it, but acknowledged that he thought they were very happy whose fancies were under the power of such impressions. He said, if a man says he cannot believe, what help is there? For it is not a master of his own belief, and believing was at highest but a probable opinion. Here Rochester is revealing that he can't believe in a God, even if he wanted to, because it's not his choice. Rochester actually makes a remarkable recovery. He's fine again, he's fine. And Graham Greene tells us that sort of by the autumn of 1697, Rochester's still arguing with wit and brevity of an existence without God, or at least, if not without a God, at least one that's not judging, not one with judgment. Rochester talks about a force that he thinks is omnipotent in the world, but it doesn't have any divine judgment or justice, and it's actually more of a force of nature than a deity. Of course, the problem is now we see a genuine shift in Rochester's attitude towards death. In The Disabled Debauchee, he's very much sort of like, oh, I'm going to die, it's fine. But we see in one of his last works is a translation from Seneca's Troads, Act 2. And here we see Rochester's representations of his own death. This translation focuses very much on a nothingness, an ending with no afterlife, with no God, no justice. After death, nothing is, and nothing, death, the utmost limit of a gasp of breath. He tells people not to be concerned about whether or not they're going to go to heaven and hell, because he says, after this life they shall be hurled, dead we become the lumber of the world. Devouring time swallows us whole, and part of the death confounds body and soul. And he says not to focus on things like God and the devil and heaven and hell, because these are senseless stories, idle tales, dreams, whimsies, and no more. He sends this translation specifically to a friend, Charles Blount, who sends back a really reassuring message to Rochester, saying, indeed, the hand that wrote it may become lumber, but sure the spirit that dictated it can never be so. No, my lord, your mighty genius is a most sufficient argument of his own immortality. And so this is sort of revealing an aspect of Rochester we've not really seen before, in which he's afraid of nothingness. He's afraid that he will become nothing. And Charles Blount is trying to explain to him that his work will survive him. His work and genius will outlive him. Unfortunately, now comes 1680. Rochester rides to his home in Woodstock and seriously injures himself. He bursts one of the ulcers in his bladder. And he knows now that he is going to die. He's very certain of it. And he brings his friend Gilbert Burnett back for another conversation. Again, Gilbert Burnett talks about this in his book, Some Passages on the Life and Death of John. And we see this dramatic shift in Rochester's attitude now towards God. He's not talking about death as a finality anymore, he's now believing in the word of God. And Gilbert Burnett is saying, but now the hand of God has touched him. He says, yet all the pleasures he had ever known in sin were not worth that torture he had felt in his mind. He considered that he had not only neglected and dishonoured, but had openly defied his Maker, and had drawn many others into this like impiety, so that he looked on himself as one that was in great danger of being damned. This is very different from the disabled debauchee. This is a man who's saying that, don't follow in my footsteps. I've led people to their own damnation. People shouldn't follow me. He's now not looking about his life as someone who's enjoyed something, is reveling in the glories of his war. He's talking about somebody who has defied his Maker. He's let him down, and he knows that he's going to go to hell at this point. Later, Burnett says, he then set himself wholly to turn to God, unfeignedly, and to do all that was possible in that little remainder of his life which was before him. This is very, very different from a few months ago, as we see, in which Rochester is arguing he could never believe in God, even if he wanted to. And this is what's caused so much controversy amongst people that Rochester knew, and contemporary critics of Rochester's work, such as Graham Greene and Germaine Greer. There was a couple of reactions to this sudden repentance and belief in God that Rochester suddenly starts exhibiting in the few months before his death. There had been many reports that Rochester had died, and then it was fine, and then he was dead again, and then he was fine again. So they sent an old friend, Mr. Fanshawe, to check on Rochester, to spy on him, basically, to see whether he's actually dead or not yet. Rochester didn't have very many friends towards the end of his death. He kind of alienated everyone. So it was less of a, I hope he's okay, and more of a, are you dead yet? Mr. Fanshawe, when he got there, Rochester spent the whole time telling him he needed to repent his past sins. He spends his whole time telling him that our God is an unrelenting God to unrepentant sinners. Mr. Fanshawe doesn't even respond. He just gets up and leaves. In a letter Countess Anne wrote to her sister, she describes the interaction, what happens, and Mr. Fanshawe claims that Rochester has gone mad, that this is the ravings of a madman, possibly from mercury poisoning, because of the cures for venereal diseases and the baths that he would have used to help himself. Countess Anne was determined that Rochester was perfectly sane. She said he believed he was as well in his head as ever he was in his life. And this is something reflected by Burnet, who, in a letter to Lord Halifax, says, I am sure if you heard him pray, you would think God had inspired him with true wisdom indeed, and that neither folly nor madness comes near him. Burnet was very certain that he'd been able to convince Rochester to finally repent, to finally regret his sins and apologise for his past life. So it was a less than desirable response when Lord Halifax said, the world is grown so foolish a thing that a witty man may very well be ashamed of staying in it. This plays on the idea that perhaps Rochester didn't become Christian. Perhaps he just did this because this is what was expected of him. He does say to Burnet that he doesn't want to pray for himself. He lets other people pray for himself because that's the upbringing he has, and he knows that's what is expected of him. And Lord Halifax is playing on this idea that perhaps, really this is another satire, this is another play played by Rochester, the play of the descent into Christianity. And so the question then is asked, is this true repentance? Is this insanity? Or is this Rochester's last greatest satire? Thank you. Are there any questions?
Well done, it's very interesting.
Question?
What do you think it is? Do you think it's
Having done the research that I have, I do find it very suspicious that someone who spent hours in discourse with Burnet in the first place about God and still come out of it on the other side being like, no, I don't believe in God and I can't believe in a God. I do think it's very strange that all of a sudden he's like, oh God, I'm going to die and I need to repent my sins. I personally would much rather like to believe that this is a satire, this is just a play. He knows that he can get away with this. He has no friends by the time he dies. And this is a very good way of immortalising himself by putting himself in there. There's so many sermons preached after his death about how what a repentant sinner he was, what a great man he is now. And so I wonder if not personally, it's just part of the play. Thank you.
Question? I was wondering, you talked a lot about the one of the underlying themes or ideas that, or rather one of the ideas that underlines these three questions, repentance, insanity, or satire, is the idea of performativity. The fact that perhaps Rochester is actually putting on a performance which fits with all the other kind of performances and shows he's been putting on. How do you think that this controversy that whether he unwittingly or deliberately he created around himself and his work affected the reception of his work? How his earlier work has been read or was read in the period, or perhaps some of his later work. Was there any controversy? Is there any evidence of how his contemporaries read him in the light of his contemporaries?
I think it's difficult to say whether that's fine. I think it's difficult to say whether more people read him because of this thing, because of this controversy. But the first collection of his poetry was published after he died. So until this point, his works are being circulated around, but no one's actually published them all in a collection. And then literally the same year he dies, maybe 2 months after he's dead, there's a published full copy of collected works of all of his poems. Gilbert Burnet had a reputation for going to the bedsides of people, writing down everything they said, and then sort of selling it on. It's one of the ways he made money out of the sick. And of course that sold a lot. Like, everyone was reading this after he died. As far as I know, almost all of the sort of peoples of London had bought this book and were reading it. Because there was loads of controversy, like especially with Fanshawe and Halifax, saying that this book is not real. It's not legitimate. Like, that's not Rochester at all. So I couldn't really say whether or not people changed their readings of the poems. But we know that after he died, there was a collection published very, very soon after his death, and everyone was reading it.
Right, thank you.
I think we'll let you go now. Thank you very much. Talking about like the literature about what was written about the fair, because it was quite a big fair and it was one of the most famous ones. Also, I'm going to be looking at Pepys' diary because he was an avid visitor of the fair as well. And then I'm going to be looking at obviously the Johnson play, which was based at the fair, and also I found a pamphlet about the fair as well. So, but before that, I just want to quickly inform you about the actual fair. It was founded in 1133, and it was originally a religious festival about, to celebrate St Bartholomew. And it ran until like 1855, so it's a massive fair. Because it started off as a festival and then it kind of moved into more of a market, and it was really famous for being a cloth market, where like all over Europe people would come and they'd know about this fair. But not only would it be a cloth market, it was also a place for entertainment, and also other trades as well. But there'd be plays, and there'd be loads of what we would now consider as circus acts. As well as other things. So, here you can see it. This is just a picture of the cloth market around the time. It's based like in Smithfield, and because it was quite big, and it was like based between the 4 churches. Obviously, the Great and Little Bartholomew churches, Christ Church and St Sepulchre's. And this map is based around 1676-79. It says from the thing. So this is the closest representation of what it actually looked like from the period that we're looking at on the literature. So, as I said, it was famous for the cloth, and it was also famous for entertainment. So there was puppet plays, there was religious mystery plays, and the entertainment that was in the fair reflected what was actually happening politically, culturally, socially in the time. So there was a lot of play when the gunpowder plot went off. There'd be plays around it, and people would pay quite a lot of money to go and see it. There'd also be like freak show type entertainment, tight ropes. Like Pepys' wife loved the dancing, and as you can see in this quote, so my wife and I went to the fair, and I showed her the Italians dancing the ropes and the women that do strange tricks, and so I put home vexed on my mind about Antitrust. So here in this picture as well, you can see that it's calling it, and there's like a little picture of like some contortionists. So you see the type of entertainment that Pepys and his wife would enjoy as well. They usually passed through it, or they purposely went to the fair as well. With the plays as well, some theatres would close as well and come towards the fair because that's where the people would be, that's where their money would be. And yeah, so there'd be loads of plays and there'd be loads of entertainment. One thing that the fair was very notorious for was pickpockets. And every piece of literature that's from the time and afterwards that I came across mentioned pickpockets. I found on eBay that there was a pamphlet, and it basically talks about the fair in and it always talks about how you have to be careful about the pickpockets. This quote, take this caution along with you, let one eye narrow you that no one makes a motion into your pocket. So it's just keep an eye on your purse and you'll be all right. And there was a really good, in this pamphlet, it compares pickpockets in the market to length for fishmongers, because obviously fishmongers did quite well in Lent, so pickpockets did well at the fair. And also, Pepys does mention it a few times when he goes to the fair, like, be careful. So, yeah. Another thing also is good old prostitutes. So the fair, entertainment-wise, men would go and they would have their little jolly. But there was this quote from Pepys after that to quote Bartholomew Fair, and they were put on this motion, a pitiful alehouse where we had a dirty substitute come up, and that were whores. So they don't necessarily go to the fair for it, but they come across quite a few of them. And my heart went against them, so you might want to do it, but we don't know. So I also found an auction specifically for the fair, and some of the descriptions are quite graphic. But yeah, there's this type of advertisement, so people would just generally go just to get a prostitute and sleep with them. So when I was looking at Johnson's the fair plays play, he does, some of the characters do get tricked into becoming whores, and obviously I'll speak about his play now. So basically, his play is said to be about nothing. It has been criticised that it is about nothing. It hasn't got a central, two pairs of central characters. Some say that it's irrelevant, like what they do is irrelevant, and there's quite a lot of wordplay in the play. So they do speak for quite a while, and sometimes you don't really know why. But actually, to criticise the criticism, it is a play about something. It just tells us about what the lifestyle was like in that period of time, why people went to the fair, what relevance they had at the fair. So there's characters that represent the Puritans. There's obviously the characters that go off and act and become prostitutes. There's so many things. There's that marriage license being nicked off of everybody, and there's people pretending, like dressing up as other people. There's puppet plays. Puppet plays were really big at the time, and Pepys and his wife used to go see this play performed as like a puppet play, as well as the original cast and like actual people. So yeah, when you read it, it does show actually what the fair was like, more than it doesn't. I don't think it necessarily needs to have a plot. It does have a plot, but it does show us what the lifestyle and the moral compass of people. Like people would lie and trick and dress up as other people to get certain things, like the marriage licenses. But also it does display that the market was quite lawless. There was not really a lot of control in the fair. And I've got a quote, it says, "Expose all the faults of an unregulated marketplace," which was quite true in the fact that they didn't want it regulated, because if they started regulating things, like the plays and stuff would have to be regulated, they'd have to be censored, and then there wouldn't be that freedom of the plays. So they were just, and also in the play, there we go. So there is this quote from Pepys as well: "Seated ourselves close by the King and the Duke of York and Madame Palmer, which was of great content, and indeed I never enough admire her beauty. And here it was Marlborough Fair, with the puppet show acted today, which has not been these 40 years. It being so satirical against Puritan, they durst not till now, which is strange they should already dare to do it, and the King does pronounce it, but I never do like it for the better of the puppets rather than the worse. So basically in here, the first bit, so we can see that actually this play was enjoyed by both the king went to see it, but also as well as the fair, it wasn't the fair and this play wasn't just for a certain group of people, it's for the poor and for the rich. You would see in countless texts that you'd get duchesses and you'd get kings come in and enjoy the fair, as well as the poor people and the citizens of London and the tradesmen. Also, we see that actually Pepys is a massive fan. He said it's the best comedy in the world, I quote, which I'm not sure I agree with, but yeah, he's a big fan, but I think that's purely because he, obviously it's satirical against Puritanism. But as again he said, he does like the other play better than the puppets version. So, just to conclude, yeah, but I think that the play really shows like the lifestyle, as well as the pamphlet, if we go back to the pamphlet. This one, it just basically, it's kind of like a Gold's Horn book in the fact that it's just like, you can do this, you've got to behave this way, but actually, just be careful. And it was just an array of things. You could get your cloth, you could get prostitutes, and you could enjoy a nice puppet or two, or a show of like dancing ladies, or just freak shows. So that is about Donald Fair.
Okay, well done, Katie.
Questions? Oh, do you set up with this?
No. Would you want to go to the fair?
Oh god, yeah. Yeah, so I was reading about it, and there's quite a lot about, when you read about it, you get a really good sense of what it would actually feel like. There's quite a lot of description about the smells. There'd be loads of food. There was like a, Pepys went to ate some like pig from this pig woman, I can't remember, Ursula or something. And there'd be loads of food markets as well. And I think the entertainment wise as well, like throughout like the whole time, it's always been an entertainment element, even right up till the 1800s. Yeah, that's what I would go for, I think.
What one do you think gives a better representation of it? The Bartholomew Fair the play or Pepys's Diary?
Probably the play, but purely because because you get more into the characters, whereas Pepys only kind of mentions it and you go, I like that because we went to the first day. I liked this. We went to that. It wasn't really descriptive in the sense that you couldn't get a feel for it, whereas the play does. You do get a feel for how it felt.
But they're both kind of balance.
They support each other in a sense, yeah.
Do you think Bartholomew's Fair would work now? Do you think we could have this fair in London now?
Maybe not prostitutes and the advertisement for it.
Not
I think it would work. Like it's kind of like the markets. When I was reading it, it reminded me of a market at home, like a London market, as they are now. Then the hustle and bustle, the shouting, and like come get your apples type thing. Just without the like tightropes and the performing.
Can we have the tightropes in the performance?
Yeah, I would be down for that. Yeah.
I think that was kind of my question really, was the extent to which you think that Bartholomew Fair, which you're right, has been criticised for being kind of a bit hard to get an angle on and so on, is actually an attempt to give exactly that kind of impression of a space that is sprawling and kind of ill-disciplined and all over the place.
I think that really, you said it right in the fact that it's quite hard, I found it quite hard to follow, but I think that's the whole atmosphere of a market is the fact that it's chaos. And the way he wrote it kind of represents that. And I think if it was, like, obviously I haven't seen it, but I think it'd be quite good to produce the play again, but like, I don't know,
Would you put a modern twist on it, or would you keep it as it was? Like,
I think it'd be good as like an EastEnders type market.
I've seen it done extremely badly, actually,
Yeah.
a couple of times. Yes. quite difficult to do well.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's quite, yeah.
Do you think it's got more value as like a historical text rather than a piece of literature? Because it demonstrates what the history was rather than maybe as an actual enjoyment play.
Sometimes, in some aspects, obviously, like the lifestyles of the characters and stuff, but also I think because it is quite satirical and it is still a comedy, it does show what plays, like what they would find funny, and even though it's quite, even because it wasn't performed for quite a while either, because it was only performed twice when it first was released, and then for a while it wasn't performed. And then when Pete saw it again, when he first saw it, that's when it first started coming out again. And I think people still found it funny, even though it was only like 100 years ago that it was actually relevant.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
All right. I have horrible memory, so I'm going to have some slides. I'm going to be talking about animal performance, particularly animals in street theater and poetry. But I'm also going to bring in two plays of the period, Volpone by Ben Jonson and Ram Alley by Lord Barry, as I believe, even though Lord Barry's Ram Alley isn't as well known, it has a really good example of primates and sexuality and disguise. So I will be using that.
Got that little one,
Keep in mind I'm going to be using different terms. Apes and monkeys were not entirely the same thing. Monkeys were considered a little more sexual than apes. Apes were more imitation. Although they have been used interchangeably, as the period was very had a very blurred consideration of animal and human lines. It also had very blurred lines between what the animals were. I'm going to be talking about baboonizing, and baboons, technically, they're old world monkeys, but this is not really important because the theater frequently just used this term. However, baboons had a very special place when they were used. In some cases, for example, in a Magdril written around 1608 by Thomas Wilkes, Aries of Fantastic Spirits, an ape, a monkey, and a baboon got together, and well, the ape and the monkey swore they were in sympathy with each other. The baboon claimed that it was more knavish than the other two, and it claimed that while the ape was performing on a horse in a garden, and the monkey was performing in a great man's house, the baboon claimed that it was an animal who was performing on the street. It claimed that it had uncontained performance. It was not contained, and this is very much made it suitable as an animal for city comedies because, like all the disguise and artifice in city comedies, the baboon sort of embodied this. And it continued to be a performing animal. And this probably inspired Rochester later in the period as well. Rochester's choice of the monkey when he's talking about whether the animals that he would prefer to be rather than rational man is actually significant because the monkey is considered a very sensual animal. And here he is dangling the poet's laurel over the monkey's head. And so in this case, he's considering the monkey's sensuality, sexuality, all those connotations as a sort of a good thing. Whereas in this photo, it can be seen as sort of a satire against John Dryden. So Rochester kind of embraced two different visions of animal imitation. The positive one, where the animal is more free, and the one where the animal is also represents something less, something more lesser, more imitative, more hard. It's hard to explain. Sort of where there's more to the monkey and less at the same time. He also embraces this conversation in Epilogue to Love in the Dark, as was spoken by Mr. Haynes, when he's talking about how a disregard for or quality of performance over spectacle. He says, players turn puppets now at your desire, in their mouths nonsense, in their tails a wire, they fly through clouds and showers of fire. Now, this reference to tails could possibly refer to a baboon, as they were known for their long tails, as well as earlier in the period their long tools, which I think we all know what that is. He also says, false accent and neglectful action too, they have both nice or good, yet neither true. They're both together like an ape's marked face, by near resembling man do disgrace. And here, again, the ape and its imitation is considered a bad thing. It's something that he's talking about, a performance where the actor is failing, imitating the real thing, which is man. Turning into a beast, turning into a baboon. Randall Cotgrave in 1611 talked about to baboonize, to play the monkey, to use apish or foolish tricks, knavish pranks, also to deceive cousin and Gaul. This very much links to concerns of the period, of earlier modern period. Rochester was writing way after this, but he is picking up where these things were left. Here, not all languages use ape or monkey, but it's considered more sexual. For example, hot as monkeys is used in Othello. It's a very much unconstrained sexuality as well as performance. And this is what the baboon has claimed earlier in Fantastic Spirits. It is the more knavish, cunning, and it is very much wanting to gull people, con them, as it were. Okay, in a particular example, Nano speaks to Castrone and Androgeno to defend that he is the best assistant to Volpone. And Volpone, I'm not as good at. He's saying, "'Tis foolish indeed, I'll set you both to school." And then he says, he talks about his shape, and he says, what else? I'm a pretty little ape. He's imitating his master. That's his role. His role is to imitate a greater man. So again, Johnson is using ape imagery to talk about this shift between man and beast, imitative beast. And here, it's used in sort of a positive sense, but also a negative sense. It's positive because by claiming to be sort of apish and ugly and monstrous, but not claiming to be a man, Nano is at an advantage. But because he is a man and not a beast, he's kind of, it's a bad thing overall. It's blurring the lines between human and animal, which also was happening in the period because there was one actor called Thomas Green who actually played the ape in some in some plays, they sometimes did not have an actual ape playing the ape. They had a man instead. Okay, Ram Alley, or Merry Tricks, is actually very much, it's connected to an actual street, which was a freedom for criminals. It was had all sorts of the bad sorts. And it's and in this, Lady Constantina delivers to her lover, disguised as a page boy, a love letter, and to establish her place as a man, she tells this this tale body tale of how a woman who went to see the baboons started thinking about them and then tied herself up in knots. And then she became a spectacle for the neighbors, who claimed that her husband, if he would show her, could get more money than a performing baboon. So here we have street theater, uncontained sexuality, all these points coming together in the very first line. As a play, Ram Alley is very derivative. It has a discussion of hiding people in back doors, which is very familiar from Middleton's Michaelmas Turn. Also, in contrast, if you turn to the handout, I have Rochester's poem, Artemisia, Beau in the Country, which I think kind of, the way that the woman in that poem talks to the monkey is actually very similar to what happens in Ram Alley. It's not as sexual, but it also has those tones to it. So to bring everything full circle, Rochester, when he's talking about apes, is using an already established form of animal imagery to describe behavior. He's drawing on all these traditions that have kept running through theater. Street theater would have not been shut down during the closing of the theaters, or actually during the Civil War. It would have continued on. So he's drawing on something that he's familiar with, something that doesn't stop, never stops. Performance never stops for these primates. One interesting thing was there was a license for a troupe of performing baboons issued in I just had it written down, 1606. So even though some of them may have been regulated, they put on performances that were unregulated. They sort of, in primates, performances were able to sort of comment on the bestiality of human behavior as well. And also it kind of encompassed everything about what people wanted to think of themselves, in a way. So it's like people could look at something that was a sort of human but not quite human and try to embrace that in their own lives, I guess. Right.
interesting. Alice is right in there.
Were monkeys, apes, and baboons often brought into plays, or was it normally people dressing up as monkeys and baboons? Because I know it's slightly out of the time period, but in Evelina,
Yes.
they bring in a monkey for that, and it like dances around. It's dressed as a man and everything.
Yeah.
Or was it more a sort of metaphorical thing, like they mention it, but there's no actual baboons or monkey?
Well, obviously performing with an animal is difficult, which is probably why Thomas Green performed as a baboon. I think there was another anecdote where someone called Gru also performed, and Andrew Gru, yes, also performed, and he is actually, it's unclear what he was.
That's great.
In some areas. I would think that they probably didn't, like, in the theater as much because they mostly use language to represent this metaphor, but I would assume that they could, and probably,
Because I think street performers.
yeah, street performers would have,
It's slightly different
for
to
sure.
staged plays.
Stage is a reputable place.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, you can
Which
shoot
kind of
people
goes
with
in with the idea of like the street becoming the theater.
Do you think that they used the metaphor of monkey as like a distancing themselves from that, but part of their personality? So like it's part of them but not, if that makes sense?
Well, as I said, there's like two different lines. Like Rochester's going down like, okay, this is a good thing, this free sexuality deal, libertine philosophy that he was embracing. So I think in a way they used it to distance themselves, but I think that they also wanted to become closer in some ways.
Like an acceptance kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you see anything, because obviously the idea of animals bearing human characteristics or kind of being symbolic or something like that goes right back to classical times. Did you see anything in the 17th century text you're looking at that was very specifically about their world? Something, especially the distinction I thought was really interesting between a monkey and an ape. Is a baboon a monkey or is it an ape?
As far as I'm, like, if you're going into the classification, they specified it, which is interesting. It's like they would use the word baboon specifically instead, and as I said, classification-wise, baboons are generally recognizable because of their tails rather than their non-tails. So I would say that they probably would have distinguished baboons from apes, but I did not see anything in the period that suggested that they exclusively did so.
Right, thank you very much, and well done.
Okay, so my presentation is on the topic of marriage and gender in the Country Wife and the Roaring Girl, and exploring how that's been explored through these plays. So just a quick little bit of background. So the Roaring Girl is sort of towards the beginning of the 17th century in 1611, and the Country Wife is towards the end in 1675, when they were roughly written. But they both explore the theme of sort of controversial relationships and comedy and some slight tragedy, but it's not really tragedy in the sense that it's tragic like a Shakespeare tragedy. It's kind of, they make it comical and funny and pleasurable, sort of like like Lee Evans or Michael McIntyre makes relationships funny now. The terrible things about relationships he makes funny. Well, they make adultery and whoring around hilarious. and it makes it a much more pleasurable experience for the audience because it's things that they're familiar with. It's real life things that are happening in London, and they're able to relate to it. It enables them to appeal to a wider audience. So there was the 17th century was turbulent because the theatres were open on and off for various reasons throughout the Restoration period, and just because of the plague. So there was we had the public and the private playhouses, and these kind of plays made it accessible for people in both public and the private playhouses because nobody's free from scandal. So The Roaring Girl is by William Whiteley, and it's centred around the tale of his son, Sebastian, who wants to marry this lovely girl Mary. Unfortunately, she's not eligible, according to his father. So it's, he wants to disobey her, and he does so using the scapegoat, as you will, Moll Cutpurse, who's actually based on the real-life character of Moll Firth, who was infamous for being a slight hermaphrodite and just doing what she pleased. Moll was just a little bit of a rebel, really. She didn't follow the conventions of an obedient wife, and Sebastian uses this to show his father, Sir Alex, that actually Mary's a lot better option than Moll. So he tricks him into thinking, actually, I'm going to go marry Moll. His father sends someone in to spy on Moll, and despite the rumours that she's, she is a cutpurse and whoring around and is a hermaphrodite, she actually proves herself to be honest and doesn't fall for the tricks. There's subplots within the subplots and tricks within the tricks, and everybody's in disguise. And the further subplots are the marriage of Mr. and Mrs. Openworks and Mr. and Mrs. Gallipots, and both of them focus around different strengths in marriage, but it's in different ways. So Mr. and Mrs. Openworks, Mrs. Openworks' seducer is thankfully more interested in money than he is in sex, but she's actually interested in him. In the end, it falls apart because Mr. Openworks is a little bit gullible, whereas Mr. and Mrs. Gallipots, they come together to, expose her seducer. And just quickly, I want to go back. Sorry. This is an image of Moll Cutpurse. As you can see, she is a woman. She carries a sword, but she is male and female clothing. The Country Wife was written by Middleton and Decker, and again, it's another play with several complicated subplots, including Horner's mixed attempts to seduce the virtuous women, and Jack Pinchwife's wife Marjorie, who was a woman of the country, which is the title Country Wife came from, and Jack keeps her in the country and then is afraid of being cuckolded by Horner. Again, another just subplot of trickery. Horner ends up falling in love with her. Marjorie dresses as a man so that she can go out and see London because he's afraid of being cuckolded, but Jack can't expose her when Horner flirts with her as a man because then it exposes that she's in disguise. Again, all very funny. She develops this interest in the city life and wants to be exposed to it, and Horner develops an interest in her. But it's the key thing again of male patriarchy and man's his control over his wife in the marriage. It's all centred around his male insecurities, whereas in The Roaring Girl it's actually Sebastian's father's insecurities if his wife isn't good enough, and his control over his son and who he marries, whereas here it's more Pinchwife's control over his wife. And in The Roaring Girl, Moll represents this rebellion, whereas in Country Wife, Marjorie represents this rebellious side. In marriage, the first quote is, "Now I think I'm rid of her, and shall have no more trouble with her. Our sisters and daughters, like users of money, are safest when put out, but our wives, like their writings, never safer in our closets under lock and key." This is Jack Pinchwife on his wife. and all the other women. And it's such a poignant quote, because it just, your wife isn't safe unless you lock her up. And it's interesting that he compares women to pieces of writing, because not many people in the century could write. So writing was really a form of advanced liberation, and it's something that he can't restrain. And throughout, the key point in The Country Wife is that eventually Marjorie does trick him through her writing. He forces her and threatens her with physical abuse to send a letter saying that she doesn't fancy Horner, and she actually is able to write and swaps the letters around for a love letter. And it's interesting because he compares her to a piece of writing that must be locked up, but her writing is a form of liberation. Whereas in the Roaring Girl, Moll writes, "I have no humour to marry. I love to lie both sides of the bed, myself and again at the other side. A wife, ought to be obedient, but fear me, I'm too headstrong to obey. Therefore I'll never go about it. I love you so well, sir, for your good, and I'll be loath to represent your bargain again, and therefore we'll never come together at first. I have the head now of myself, and I'm man enough for a woman. Marriage is but a chopping and changing, where a maiden loses one head and has worth and place." This is Moll's attitudes on marriage, and you can see why that she rebels against it, because Jack's saying women should be locked up, and she represents that disobedient and strong-headed side of a woman who wants to be liberated. And Marjorie represents that as well, but not as aggressively as Moll does in her transvestite clothes and her outward attitude. Marjorie's rebellion is more inward and more of a psychological triumph over Jack, whereas Moll exerts it in a more brash and bolshy kind of way, and it presents two different sides to marriage. Moll literally wears the trousers, and Marjorie is metaphorically wearing the trousers, which is quite nice. And the gender roles. So Moll threatens to blur the boundaries of male and female and provoke simultaneous admiration, desire, abhorrence and fear by boldly challenging social and sexual values. This is a really cutting-edge, exciting thing. Even now, gender roles are still being challenged, and for gender roles to be challenged through literature in such a patriarchal society is exciting, and it's funny, and that's why it's successful in the play. But it's, plays are a form of almost ruleless and liberating experiences for the people, and that's what Moll represents. It represents two kind of sides to what people think. Both of the plays represent that actually you can have different opinions on this, and it's kind of okay. Neither one are wrong or right for women to behave in these ways. And in a century where few women were able to sign their names, again, it's the importance of being able to write. It's women being able to express themselves in different ways. Moll, a potential lowlife, a thief, a hermaphrodite. She's expressing herself outwardly, and again, Marjorie expresses herself inwardly, slightly externally through her writing, but it's this metaphorical and physical of who does wear the trousers, and it's showing that actually women can wear the trousers physically and mentally over their husbands. So, in summary, both plays are successful. They focus on the adultery of women through several subplots and the resistance to the patriarchal rule, challenging the conventions of men's oppression within marriage, allow women to be liberal with their actions, which is kind of the only place it was really accepted was in the playhouse, and it enables the audience to explore this different world through their actions, offering a different attitude to the ones commonly accepted of the non-conforming women, makes them more of a heroine. So, yeah, psychological pants. very much.
Okay, oh, right. Casey.
Do you think, because you said that one actually wears the pants and one metaphorically, what do you think works better? What do you think gets across to the audience better, like this resistance?
I think that the physical wearing of the pants, because it's a visual thing, whereas we know that the Night of the Burning Pestle did not succeed because it was too complex, they couldn't understand it. And I think the audience in medieval, well, Restoration London really needed to see the wearing of the pants. And it's all very funny, but not all of them can process it. So I think that The Roaring Girl definitely appeals to a wider audience. But I think as you get further on into history, like, you know, later and later, we understand the psychological wearing of pants. Yeah.
Do you know much about the reception of Moll's character? Did people like her? Was she a loved character or was she a ridiculed character?
Well, she was, in real life, she was ridiculed, but in the play, she's more seen as a sort of a heroine because despite this awful reputation that she has, actually she rebuffs attempts for, I can't think his name was, something like Rafe, or I can't remember his name, I can't remember his roundhouse, something like that. Anyway, so Alex's spy, he attempts to trick her into stealing and admitting that she's this awful person. And actually, she just says, you may all think this of me, but sometimes I sleep with women, sometimes I sleep with men, sometimes I wear trousers, sometimes I don't, but I'm not a bad person. And it kind of rebuts the stereotypes of her being slightly rebellious. It doesn't make her a bad person, it just means that she's different. And it enables the audience to be more accepting of it and see her more of a heroine because through her rebelliousness she's able to bring together true love. So even though he's pitting Mary against Moll because it's like, oh well, one's worse than the other, but yeah, she's a bit of a heroine. She saves the day at the end.
Wish we
True
had
love
this
may prosper.
included in modern day writing.
I know.
Like some Moll characters,
Great
please.
play. It's a really good play. It's kind of sort of two-part question really related to The Roaring Girl. The first is about the kind of chronology. You started off by saying rightly that one of them was from the kind of early Jacobean period, basically, and then the other play, The Roaring Girl, the Country Wife, is a restoration play, a 1670s play. Isn't it interesting then that your argument seems to be that of the two, it's The Roaring Girl that's rather more kind of bold in its presentation of kind of an emancipated woman?
Yeah, it is interesting, but I was reading, because The Roaring Girls, obviously written by Wynchley, I must say it, and the other one is a combination of Dekker and Middleton, and Dekker's always slightly more reserved, and it's been argued that Middleton actually doesn't have a direct style that people can kind of recognise as such, like he's not. And I just think it's the combination of those two writing together that makes it sort of more reserved, rather than, you know, Wynchley's doing it all on his own. I think that's why it's a bit more free and a bit more outrageous. I think it just depends on the style of the two playwrights.
The other thing that kind of related to that play, you're aware that there's a story, no one's substantiated it, but there is a story that Moll Cutpurse herself actually performed on the Fortune stage in that play, at least one occasion.
Yeah,
Do you
I think that's interesting, but because that's another thing about women and what they're able to do is, you know, generally it was the King's Men or Children companies that would do performances, and not many women would be actually allowed on stage. And in a lot of her depictions, in her images, she does look considerably manly. So whether they would even recognise her. But I think that really, if you're gonna, what is it? The Danish Girl was released recently, and people were arguing that they should have actually had a real transgender person playing instead of Eddie Redmayne, but I don't think you get a real representation. And I think it's kind of the same in here. I think it would benefited them more to see a woman playing a woman in man's clothes. But obviously you can't change history.
That's interesting, actually. Okay. Right, thank you very much indeed. Well done.